All right, hello everybody. Welcome in. It's a lovely day. Here we all are. Um, Obviously, as I said today, and as the title of the video actually itself is, today is a kind of finalising and a kind of final catch-up session, I suppose. Not catch-up really; is not the term for it, but a final session on Hamlet for the term. Obviously, this is the end of the half term this week, which is kind of crazy. But we're here. We finished the play last week. Finished it off then. So today what we're going to do is we're going to go back over the kind of stuff that we were talking about a little bit in last time and the time before that on terms of critical approaches to text. So that's what we're going to be looking at today is just trying to get down our understanding of what we mean by these critical approaches, how they function, what we're going to be doing with them, etc., and how to use them properly. I've talked a little bit, and I did that video on AO5 before, going through that in detail, so obviously you can go and watch that on the channel. Is that guide to AO5, which was hopefully really useful for you. But today I want to have a look at actually how we get about this in Hamlet itself. And I also want to talk about the way in which the play needs to be handled, and in fact literature in general needs to be handled for the course. Because I think it is going to help you in general get to the bottom, I suppose, of what we're doing with the writing, and I think that will be really useful for you in the long run. As a quick reminder then, task of the week, watch your production of Hamlet that you haven't seen yet. So again, use Digital Theatre Plus for that, please. Loads of good versions on there, so if you've watched a couple already, choose a new one. That gives you something to watch. There's also obviously a task to write a short review of this new production, so whichever one that is new to you that you've watched, just chuck on a short review. That's the main task for me this week, realistically, and it doesn't have to be particularly formal. It's entirely up to you. But I just want a kind of maximum 500 word, just a review of the production. I just want to see your thoughts and feelings. You know, did you like the way they presented like certain characters? Did you think that the themes came through? Did they emphasize certain aspects of the text? Did they underplay others? That's fine. Those are the kind of things that we're really looking at here, actually. So that would be great. And then the third one is to create, as I kind of called it, a kind of super document for your critical quotations. So to have some kind of, you might have already done this, in which case, well done. I don't need to chase you on this. But if you haven't, then an overall document for your critical quotations, please, would be excellent. Okay, so something that kind of brings it all together. What you might want to do as well is take the long ones that you've got on your posters, and I was talking about this in the feedback that this week I've gone through all the feedback as well for the previous week already, and then for the rest of the week now and over the half term, I'm going to be doing feedback on the Basola / whatever the other option was, essays for Duchess of Malfi, and I'm going to be getting that back to you over the holiday. Okay, so that's good. But what I was saying on some of the feedback I was giving this week was that we are using perhaps these long quotes on the posters, which are really impressive, and that's really good, and that's lovely that you found these quotes and this evidence. But what I would say on that front is that if you keep the quotes too long, then you run the risk of having quotes that you won't be able to use in exams. So take those quotes that you have already, that's great, and then just try and trim out the kind of key short phrases that are memorable, that are going to stick in your head, so that when you are in an exam, you can use them. Okay, and that's what I would put in this document here. Okay, so that's realistically that for the week. As I said today, there's not really any text involved. In fact, I've not actually used any quotes of the play at all today necessarily, because what I want to talk about is how we approach texts instead, and specifically this idea of critical approaches that is so key to the AO5 for this test. And most importantly, this AO5 is important for your coursework, which we are going to be starting next half term. This is a lovely thing as to why I've kind of moved the Hamlet into the first year, is that now we've covered and gotten to grips somewhat with, although we're not fully to grips with it yet, and that's fine. We're going to come back to all the play stuff after we finish the poetry at the start of your next year. So we have got time to come back to it and go, actually, we're going to go through it in a little bit more depth. We're going to look at some more thematic approaches then anyway. But what I'm saying is, next half term, because the coursework has an AO5 aspect to it, we've now already introduced it to you. So what I do with you for the next half term is I go through with you some of the critical and contextual perspectives around the poetry that you're going to be studying, and the literature that you're going to be studying for your coursework, and then Linda will start taking you through more of the literary side of things. Okay, so hopefully that will all kind of fit together quite neatly for you, so that you have a good understanding overall of what's going on there. Okay. With that in mind, let's get to it. So this is obviously the PowerPoint for today. I'm going to send this out to you afterwards, so you've got things. I said the lesson objective was to explore feminist approaches to text. I think that's kind of partly it, just because we haven't covered them yet. But I think mostly it's just about overall, what is the critical approach to Hamlet? How can we take this on board? And I'm going to start with something that I think I talked to my Langlit group about last week, and it's something that I actually took, and I've literally just cut and pasted this this tweet here that I particularly enjoy from a professor, and I think this is something I really want to get us on board with now, because I think when some of us are asking for feedback on our work, I still think, and when we're talking about the text in general, I still feel that we're trying to discover almost secret meanings in text, and we're trying to uncover what Shakespeare wanted necessarily to say, rather than focusing on what Shakespeare does. And likewise with Webster as well. We're getting better at this, but I still think there's a kind of part of us that's like going like, oh, what is the meaning, what's the secret hidden meaning of this text? Other than obviously, what is the meaning of this line, which is fine. I can tell you what the linguistic meaning of a line is. That's not a problem, obviously. But what we're too often doing, I think, is trying to find the kind of secret hidden meaning of a work of literature. And actually, what the whole course is about is not that at all. That's not what we're doing at any of these 3 units that you do: the poetry, the drama, or the prose. What we are actually looking at when we're doing analysis, and this is what I've said here, when we are doing analysis, we are not trying to work out a secret that exists within the text. What we're actually trying to do is to develop our own skills of interpretation, okay, to critically evaluate what a work presents, and not to kind of work out exactly what Shakespeare wanted. I think working out exactly what Shakespeare wanted is basically a fool's game. You will never, ever know what any author who's been dead for that long wanted to say in their work. And to be honest, Shakespeare himself might not have known. It's not important. What we want to do is to be able to develop our skills, have frameworks of analysis so that we can go, right, this is what is in the text, these are the characters that are present, this is what they say, this is what they do, and taking those actions and ideas, what I am going to do as a student of English literature is I am going to bring all those ideas together to perform my own arguments, my own interpretation, because I think, and this is where the biggest problem comes with our writing overall, and that all of us possibly still have some moments of falling into the trap of, is that we still try to explain the text too much. We're still trying to go, this is what it means, whereas actually what we want to be talking about is, this is what the text suggests. These are the meanings and ideas that are suggested by the text. And here is my evidence to prove it. Here is the quote. I've now pulled out some more evidence from this quote. Here's some other stuff. There you go. Now, obviously, when we do Marxist feminist critique as the 2 perspectives that I've been giving you these 2 weeks, because they're the easiest ones. Obviously, there's other things like structuralism, post-colonialism, formalism, etc., etc., etc. Those are other styles that you can do. These are just 2 pretty straightforward ones, the most obvious ones, I think, and they're going to be the easiest ones to do with the poetry next half term, which is why I'm kind of building you up to them. But what we are not trying to do is we are not trying to prove whether Shakespeare was a Marxist. We are not trying to prove whether Shakespeare was a feminist. Both of these ideals obviously don't happen at that time period. It's unlikely that he would be one. But what we can do is subject these texts to the scrutiny of these perspectives. We can use these critical frameworks to access the text and try and go, hey, look, this is what this framework kind of believes around the world. This is how Marxists view the world. This is how feminists view the world. This is how this is how structuralist writers view the world. or they view literature. With that in mind, what can I work out? What can I read in the text in terms of stuff that perhaps presents interesting dynamics that I didn't notice before and that you might not notice on a naive reading. And I think that's the key thing. It's like, what can we notice about texts? What can we talk about them? How can we talk about them more interestingly? Okay, so that's going to be the key thing here. So just to kind of recap some of the stuff last time we talked about, I just want to kind of go back over a Marxist reading of Hamlet. So obviously then goes reminder, then the core of Marxist literary theory, and this is specifically the core of Marxist literary theory, not the core of Marxist political theory, which is slightly different obviously, is exploring the nature of the text and the way in which it reflects, challenges or supports the socioeconomic nature of the society and writer in which it, who and in which it was produced by and for. So this is the kind of key thing, is that it's often placed in, and I've got a book obviously that I can't lend you now because we're on lockdown, but I will be posting some extracts from later. But very much for the Marxist school of literary criticism, they're very much concerned with placing it within the kind of cultural material history of that work. Yeah, who could access this text? Why would they be accessing it? What ideological positions does it support? And then that's when it ties into the Marxist political theory, in terms of we are looking at representation of social classes and narratives around class and class interaction. Okay. And obviously then which classes and which narratives around class the play itself supports, and we're going to do a little example on that in a second. Possibly one you may, I don't know, maybe I've done this to you before, but if I have, then unlucky, it's fine. Obviously we can start off with the fact that, this play, despite the fact that this play would be performed for a broad audience, that the focus of the play itself and the focus of most tragedies especially, and comedies to an extent, but certainly tragedies, focuses almost entirely on the ruling class. The characters who make up the core of the cast list are ruling class figures. They are either monarchs or monarchs in waiting in the case of Hamlet, or they are the kind of elite political class in the case of someone like, I don't know, a Polonius figure. Those are, Polonius, Lord Polonius, as he's referred to, Laertes and Ophelia, while certainly inferior in rank to Hamlet, are not. And they have their own class struggles, don't get me wrong. There is certainly a kind of divide place in the play between them. And that's actually, I think, the core of one of Polonius's worries, isn't it? Is that he's, well, at least Ophelia is perhaps dallying with Hamlet, puts at risk his own social political position. But the world outside of them is very, very minimally represented. In fact, we only really see it twice, I would argue, maybe 3 times, in the guards at the start, and the first act in general, where we see them. The players, to an extent, although the players obviously have a slightly different relationship to class status and in general society, given that they seem to be a group of travelling performers, which gives them a slightly different relationship. And obviously all of this, guys, is looking at us as a pre-industrial society, so it's hard to look at this in the same ways that we look at it now. But we see the gravediggers towards the end, and we also have the king's references to the people in Act 4, specifically around Act 4, Scene 3, where the king directly references the distracted multitude, and he refers to them contemptuously. In fact, Hamlet, setting up for the play, just talking to the actors, describes the kind of idiocy of the groundlings as well, who by definition realistically were of a more poor, impoverished kind of fully usually manual labour class, a kind of serf class perhaps at the time, given the nature of the society around them. So that's one thing that we can talk about already, that this play specifically deals with only a specific strata of society. And we can think about that, obviously, and this is where the key thing here comes in with Marxist theory and these theories in general, is that we can tie this to the type of play it is. Tragedies, by definition, we know, focus on the elite. Yeah, that's core. And in fact, we know that actually, hopefully, while we were writing our Basola essay, if we were doing that one last week, we know that Basola perhaps is an unconventional tragic hero, because he doesn't fit that kind of idea of an elite, tragic figure. He's certainly not impoverished. He's clearly, he's been university educated. He is a kind of a courtier. So Basola is no kind of, he's certainly not a kind of heroic, rags to riches story. He doesn't have, not that he ever makes it to the riches, but he certainly isn't a kind of traditional classical heroic figure in that sense. And in fact, while Shakespeare doesn't really fit wholeheartedly with all of the ideals of a kind of classical tragedy, we know he subverts lots of stuff, especially the kind of Aristotelian unities. He does stick to this class thing. So if that's the case, what does that tell us about the plays? Well, we're going to have a little look at this with regards to social class, and we're going to use The Lion King as a bit of an example of this. So Claudius especially is... Now, obviously, the fact that Claudius is dismissive of the people especially, well, he's the villain, so then is that... Well, let's get into that. So, here we have The Lion King. Now, obviously, guys, plot spoilers for anyone who has not watched The Lion King at this point. If you are desperately hanging on to your hopes and dreams of watching The Lion King in the future and not having the plot spoiled for you, then maybe mute me now and you can come back to this section after you've watched The Lion King. But you have read Hamlet, so you'll have the broad gist of the plot structure, except for obviously there are lions in it. Now, obviously, I'm using The Lion King because it's simply easier to do this in a more abstract manner, and it means also that at no point, hopefully, will you apply anything that I say right now to Hamlet itself, because this is obviously a gross simplification. Now, we're going to have a look at social class and status. Now, the clue in the title of The Lion King is that this is a story about kings. Yes, and in fact, the opening section of The Lion King narrative starts with a celebration by the kind of the peoples of the Pride Lands, I believe is its name in the film. All the other animals. You get that kind of montage of the elephants and the gazelle and the zebra, giraffes and whatever else, and they're all coming to pay their kind of fealty, I guess, to the Lion King himself, Mufasa. There he is, looking very regal, and they come to pay homage to him at the birth of his son, Simba. Here, the kind of the Hamlet figure of the play, so to speak, Mufasa, the old Hamlet. And in this scenario, they're coming to pay, their tribute to him as the new king, and they all seem to love the king, despite the fact that obviously they are eaten by the lions. We never get shown it in the film. At no point do they just cut to a scene of Mufasa brutally murdering a gazelle and feeding it to his child. But we know that that's what has to happen, because we do have this specific speech about the circle of life during this section of the narrative where, Mufasa explains that it's okay for the lions to eat the antelope because they will die and become grass, and the antelope will eat that, which seems to be the flimsiest justification for this social hierarchy. And it's actually kind of very reminiscent, I suppose, of two things. One, kind of modern, billionaire economic theory, but also it also reminds us, I think, of, hopefully, the circle of life should remind us of the worm going through the king going through the guts of a beggar line that Hamlet has in Act 4. So they weren't not paying attention to Hamlet when they made this film. So, as you will well know, the good king, Mufasa, loved by everybody, is murdered unjustly by his evil brother. And if you can't tell he's evil, they've used Hollywood characteristics here, and this is really uncomfortable because they've literally just made him black, which is a separate discussion other than Marxist theory, although it's related. But he's literally called Scar. He has a big scar. He's slightly more scraggly looking. He looks evil. Now Scar takes over the Claudius of the film, and under his rule, the the kind of Pride lands fall into disrepair. Yeah, he lets in all of these kind of hyenas, who I assume are some kind of like politically sycophantic, middle class, who are kind of enforcing his cruelties on the antelope, I guess. I assume, like, we don't see any of these people ever again. Much like in Hamlet, we never really see, past that opening montage, we never really see any other animals in the Pride Lands. We just see that it gets ruined. Like, there's a lot of pathetic fallacy going on. The whole place becomes a kind of barren wasteland, which, again, looks more geological than what the impact lions can have. Obviously, it's an extended metaphor. Anyhow, the point is that under his rule, under Scar's rule, the place falls apart, right? Everything goes down. And all of the good work that Mufasa seemed to be doing previously is undone. Hamlet himself, or Simba, has been banished from the kingdom. He has left. And he then finds himself growing up with Timon and Pumbaa, who are some comic figures. And if anything, they are essentially the gravedigger figures from Hamlet. They are kind of literally, people of the earth. They eat bugs. They do all the gross things that come out of the earth. And they seem to live in some kind of classless society that borders on a kind of peace. They literally said their catchphrase is that there will be no worries for the rest of their days, because they just seem to live in this kind of idealized perfect thing where Simba, previously the prince, lives alongside a meerkat and a warthog in harmony. No one's eating anyone. Everyone's fine. They're all getting along together. Now, this seems to suggest that there is a problem here with the evil, corrupt king, that Scar is abusing his power. He is evil and corrupt. And that the only way to save the Pride Lands, if you took the film at its initial logic, would be to turn the Pride Lands from what it is under Scar into the kind of society where Timon and Pumbaa live, right? This would be fun. This would be much nicer for everyone concerned. And that would be the step. Obviously, guys, those of you who've watched The Lion King know that this isn't what happens. And instead, rather than going into this lovely idealized society, which we could imagine where Scar is just replaced, re-educated, perhaps rehabilitated into this kind of more, egalitarian system, what instead happens is that Simba comes back and just becomes exactly the same position that his father held. He becomes the new Lion King, killing off the old king, and then everything is now fine, we assume, in the Pride Lands, because Simba, like Mufasa before him, is just a good king, and he is innately good, and Scar was innately bad, and there is no complex issues to worry about. And then I guess we just have to kind of wrap these figures up somehow, because that's fine. Now, that is essentially how the narrative plays out. So while the play does clearly offer some critiques of kings in this kind of the abusive, fascistic imagery-related figure of Scar, and while it does offer a kind of idealized alternative to a kind of monarchy, the film falls back to ultimately saying, actually, you know what, the inherent structure of kingship is good. It's just that you need to have a good person at the top of this hierarchy rather than a bad person. And the only way you can tell who the good people and the bad people are is by, in the film, just using visual indicators. But there's a kind of vague, essentially almost genetic, almost lineage kind of ideal going on here. And in many ways, that is what we end up. The message of the Lion King is then not that the monarchic system itself is bad, but that there are just bad monarchs, and that the film ultimately is a re-endorsement of the system of kings. Now, is this something that you think the writers of the Lion King sat down and went, right, guys, we need to reinforce the monarchical system of lions, and we will do that during this film? No, obviously they probably did not. Well, I mean, it is Disney, so you never know, but no, they probably didn't. But what they did do was present a narrative which conveyed that message. And more importantly, with regards to Hamlet offers multiple moments of critique of the nature of power. Think about Hamlet's critiques of the king. Think about all of his language, especially in his gravediggers Timon and Pumbaa scene in Act 5, Scene 1, where he's just there going, look, Alexander the Great will be anybody else when he's dead. You know, all of the great men of history are meaningless, blah, blah, blah. But the end of the play ends up with the inevitability of a monarch taking the throne, who Hamlet himself believes to be noble. Now, we talked about this previously with the Duchess of Malfi, is that can actually Webster be subversive? And actually part of this whole issue is that, you know, the Lion King isn't to blame necessarily for this in and of itself. The issue is that it is a product produced within a society which accepts a kind of rigid hierarchical structure. For Shakespeare to suggest anything other than the re-establishment of a king, in this case, in the case of Fortinbras, a noble prince, as Hamlet defines him, to present anything other than that, you know, if Hamlet had ended with, you know, the power in the play descending to, I don't know, a couple of different people who would govern it separately, that would not be shown on stage. We know that there are censorship issues to have, but this is the interesting thing, is that we can look at how the play simultaneously critiques and offers criticisms of, but its natural structure in fact suggests kind of key issues about the ideology and beliefs of a time period, and it's kind of well explored through the play. Okay. Hopefully that all made sense then, this little diversion into the Lion King, to see, look, yes, obviously I'm not saying that the Lion King has this, but that it's something that we can read into that text. Now, feminist readings. Now, like with Marxism, we are not looking to find a hidden feminist message in the text, nor are we necessarily looking to prove that Shakespeare himself was a feminist writer. That would be a waste of our time, and we would not get very far with that. What we are looking to do instead is to explore the nature of the work and reevaluate the presentation of gender dynamics, gender relationships, power dynamics, how gender itself is explored in the play, those kind of things, and using the kind of traditional framework of feminist theory. I like the Marxist sheet in terms of what do Marxist critics do question sheet. I'll be sending you out the full document that has both of those on it. I could give them actually this week, that's fine. I'll send them over to you this week, but we'll go through them again when we look at the coursework soon. Okay, so are we concerned with the fact that Shakespeare is sexist? I'm not bothered about whether Shakespeare himself is sexist, because it A, doesn't really matter, and B, it was the 16th and 17th centuries. Of course he was. Like, what else are we going to say? There's nothing to be said there. We talked about this with Webster as well. Like, Webster is presenting, yes, characters who are divergent from norms. By all accounts, Webster's characters are relatively progressive-ish, but they still subscribe to the kind of overarching societal values and beliefs. There's nothing new there. Are we seeking to critique Shakespeare? Not necessarily. This isn't like a kind of point fingers at Shakespeare and go, wow, he represented women badly, and that's necessarily inherently a bad thing, because that's the writing of the time. That's what we're dealing with. We can't expect him to change it now. Obviously, what we can do is ask directors of Shakespeare, I suppose, to present and try and rework some of these things in an interesting angle. But that's not necessarily what we're looking at here. But what we can do is we can say, what does this play reveal about the dynamics, attitudes towards these things at the time? What are the specific attitudes presented in this play? How can we find out those specific attitudes in this play? And most of that is going to come down to looking at the way in which Shakespeare does present, these figures. In Marxist cases, it's looking at classes and statuses and things like that, like we just talked about with The Lion King. In this case, it's a case of how can we look at women writers. So, my first question for you guys is a pretty basic one. I'm just going to give you a couple minutes now. I'm going to give you this question: how much does Gertrude know? I'm going to give you a couple of seconds. I'm going to give you maybe a 2-minute thinking time, and then we will come back onto this question in a second. I think there's I'm going to put a poll up in the chat, and we're going to see what your thoughts are. We'll try and gather your thoughts. Just how much does Gertrude know? And that's quite an open-ended question, but I'm thinking here about specifically how much does she know about what her husband has done? How much does she know about what her husband is planning to do to her son? How much does she know about her son? And how much does she know about the political situation of Denmark? So I'm going to give you 2 minutes now. I'm going to mute myself. I'm going to put the opening chill out music on for 2 minutes, and then we will come back with a poll. Okay, that's time. So I've got some answers on here that I'm going to give you. I've just put in the poll. Um, I've just put in the poll there what some of the options here. Here are the main options. I want you to kind of respond to the poll. Give your best. Give your answers. Obviously, if you have a different one than those, justify your responses below. So we've got a couple of options. She knows that Claudius killed the king and that he wants to kill Hamlet. She knows that Claudius killed the king. She knows that only Claudius wants to kill Hamlet. She doesn't know anything about the king dying. She knows nothing about Claudius's actions, but she's suspicious. Or she knows nothing at all about the scheming, and she's just honestly and naively in love with her husband. And then there are some other answers in the poll as well, should you wish to explore them. So, interesting range of responses. Keep them coming in. About halfway there in terms of numbers. Over halfway now. Still got about 7, 8 responses to come in. Please, obviously, guys, justify below if you have any evidence as well to support this theory. Nearly there. Kind of a 3-answer split at the moment. Okay, couple to go. Very heavily on one answer. Okay, so 15 responses. Alright, so overwhelmingly then we have the answer, and this is perhaps one of the ones that I thought would probably come up, was she doesn't know anything about Claudius's actions, but she is suspicious. Okay, and this is the answer probably that I would come to too. And I think there's going to be one specific reason for that. And I think I want you to try and answer it for me. Why do you think, guys, that this is actually probably the only reasonable answer that we can kind of come to with any kind of certainty? And I want you to tell me that realistically. Why do you think the only answer we can come to with any real kind of sense of kind of a certainty or assuredness is that she might know something, but we can't really tell, she's just suspicious of it? Why do you think that is the case? Chuck an answer in the chat, please. Especially for those of you, the majority of you in fact, 73% of you that believed this to be the case. And we will move on once we have an answer to this. So we're stuck here until I get a response, unfortunately. We'll spend eternity just sat here waiting for this answer otherwise. Looks like we'll be here a while. Yeah, right, there we go. Or at least, yeah, there you go. So Esme rightly, I think, probably says, she doesn't actually ever confront Claudius about killing the older Hamlet, or the plans to get rid of Hamlet, but is shown to be suspicious when she drinks the poison wine. Yeah, she drinks the wine, but loves Hamlet so much, I feel she didn't know much about them trying to kill him. Yeah, I think this is it. The only hint that we have of her suspicion is the wine incident, which itself is an ambiguous moment, but I think you're absolutely right to pull that up. But there are no scenes at all where she confronts anybody. Never does she acknowledge. She has the closest she comes to having anything to do with acknowledging anything of that is the bit where Hamlet forces her to see the black and tinted spots that are on her soul in the confrontation in Act 3, Scene 4. But we mostly assume that confrontation is to do with her marital infidelity, her kind of incest. Yeah, absolutely fair, Anna. Yeah, I think that's pretty much it. I think it's just the case there that it's an implication, and obviously that implication, as we talked about at the time, is mostly down to the performance, isn't it, rather than the text itself. The big reason, guys, then why we don't have this is that Gertrude has hardly any lines. And realistically, this is my question here. In general, Gertrude and Ophelia have less lines put together. If you combine them, then I think it's Laertes they have less, and they certainly both have less than Polonius. But they are way down the list in terms of sequence that we have there. They don't have much lines at all in the play. And actually, here's a question here then, guys. So, does Shakespeare have a problem with women? Now, obviously, I don't mean he has a personal beef with women necessarily, although he might have done. My question is, does he have a problem with female characters? Here are some plays. I have got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 plays there for you. And I'm going to go through them all. The numbers here are the line numbers. You can do this for any play you want to, guys, by the way, for Shakespeare. So any play you want, you can look at the line numbers on something called Open Source Shakespeare. Just Google that up. It's a great website. In fact, I might send that through to you as today's kind of extension link for the day, should you wish. Yesterday I chucked up that Macbeth production that's currently on at the Globe, so that was hopefully quite nice if any of you wanted to fancied watching that. But Antony and Cleopatra, there's a play for you, both in the title, one of the two titular female characters in these plays here. Antony has 840 lines to Cleopatra's 680, despite the fact that Antony dies earlier. Coriolanus here has 675 lines. Then there's another character below him, and then the highest amount of lines to a female character is 311, half of Coriolanus. Julius Caesar, as you can see as well, guys, I've put in italics the title character. Julius Caesar, the most lines go to Brutus on 722. Then we have 4 characters down until we reach the highest female character in Portia, who gets 92. Portia there being the wife of Brutus, Volumnia being the mother of Coriolanus, Cleopatra being the wife of Antony. A lover, at least, depending on historical interpretation. Lear in King Lear has 749 lines. Then there are 5 characters beneath him. 5 characters until we reach the highest female character in Goneril, his daughter, at 199. Macbeth has 715 lines to Lady Macbeth's 259 lines, which is quite a jump. Now, as I've said before, it's quite a surprise, really, I think, that Lady Macbeth has such few lines. Everyone remembers her quite vividly in that play, but she has such a relatively small amount of content. In Othello, Iago has 1,088. Then we have Othello himself, and then we have Desdemona, Othello's wife, and 391, so she has less than half of the top character's lines. Romeo, again, despite dying first, has 617 lines to Juliet's 542. And Titus Andronicus, Titus at 711 lines, has 2 characters between him and Tamora, the highest female character, at 257 lines. Now, what I want you to do very quickly, guys, is anybody use their knowledge of Hamlet and other Shakespearean texts that you've studied to think, basically tell me, firstly, one question is, this is perhaps more an extension one for you to take on away from this. Do you actually think Shakespeare offers convincing female characters? That's a separate one, I think, for another day. But what can you tell me about this information? What kind of key features do we kind of find out here? Why do we think these plays specifically have such a shift between the male and female characters? Why is there such a line disparity? And also, what do you notice about the relationships of these women? What do you notice about the positions of these women in these plays? Again, chuck some comments in here, please. Any and all ideas, any kind of common recurring themes in these plays here? Any ideas as to why these female characters might have fewer lines? Any ideas as to the overarching theme of what these female characters are doing in these plays? Hopefully you'll notice the key running relationship between these plays. Yeah, sorry for the forced interaction, but it's obviously difficult without the clarity. I think obviously we would prefer that. Perhaps the discrepancy reflects the women's role in society at the time, but I could point you towards some plays where the female characters have as many lines, if not more. So yeah, I think part of this, guys, I think you're absolutely right on part of this is that, yeah, I think we've got 3 answers then in there from Ashley, from Jess, Esme, and earlier, who's just basically said the same thing-ish to each other, kind of variants on, that yes, women did have much less of a voice, and that's something we're going to talk about, is the kind of silencing of the female voice in society, and that's obviously because this is written by a man. But there's something else, that Shakespeare had plays where female characters had more lines than this. What is the kind of recurring theme here between these plays specifically? Antony and Cleopatra, Coriolanus, Julius Caesar, King Lear, Macbeth, Othello, Romeo and Juliet, Titus Andronicus. I could point you to some plays where this power imbalance is not so heavy in the lines. We could look at something like Twelfth Night. We could look at, I think, something like Much Ado About Nothing. Both of those plays have a much more, well, not necessarily balanced, but a closer to balanced narrative here. Also, I would point out as well that we have wife, mother, wife, daughter, wife, lover, well, technically wife. And then, in this case, is the only exception with Tamora, who is his enemy. Yes, they are all tragedies. Absolutely. They are tragedies. And yes, Will, absolutely correct. All the titles of these plays are specifically men. Absolutely. So, this is the thing. These are all tragic plays. And they are male title roles. Now, this is something that's important to think about then. So, if you look at Shakespeare's other plays, his non-tragedy, certainly his comedies, they are not named after figures. They do not have this same disparity necessarily, and they are realistically, in generally, kind of more balanced in terms of the roles afforded to women. Women are not just lumped into the mother-daughter role in those plays. So I think the key thing here, I think Elias kind of pointed this out correctly, these are all tragedies. So we're like, okay, then fine. Actually, that might just be it. In tragedies, we name it after a main character. That character is going to be a man. Fine. And therefore, we have the play focused around them. Okay, sure. That sounds pretty reasonable as an argument. We look at the play's conventions as having, tragedies are supposed to have people who are at the height of their social positions. That's likely to be a man. Okay, I can understand that. Except for the fact that you have been studying, as well as I have, a different play, and it was also a tragedy. So are tragedies inherently male heavy? Is that something in and of its own right that makes sense? And the answer, I would say, is no, they're not. Not necessarily. The Duchess of Malfi, we know, we are studying, that is the other court text we are doing, is literally called The Duchess of Malfi. That is its title. She is a female character. We know that. And the White Devil is ambiguous in terms of who the actual White Devil is, but most people lean towards the lead female character in that play. The Duchess has, I think, the shared most number of lines with Bosola, or slightly less perhaps than Bosola, but right up there. And she is the title figure. And obviously the White Devil is a similar scenario. Classical Greek tragedies, which we are not wholly sure as to how many of them Shakespeare read, but we have classical Greek tragedies in terms of things like Medea by Euripides, Antigone by Sophocles, Niobe, who you'll remember hopefully from Act 1, Scene 2 of Hamlet, where he compares his mother to Niobe, all tears. These were 3 tragedies, and these are just taking an example. There are others I could find, which are all narratives focused around, and especially in Euripides' case, is led by women. These are female-centric plays. Now, again, these are plays from the perspective of men. The women aren't always in line with social values and morals. Specifically, see Medea there, certainly, as well as Antigone. But this is, the attempt at their experiences are offered there, even if they are successful or unsuccessful. Which does lead us to a case where actually Shakespeare's specific tragedies tend to be male-centric. Yeah. There's a number of reasons we could look at for that. One thing that we could look at specifically is the nature of the theatre itself. Hopefully most of you will remember the fact that these plays would have been performed by all-male casts, and given the amount of jokes made about the kind of all-male nature of the cast in a Shakespearean comedy, specifically here I'm thinking of Twelfth Night, where the double cross-dressing of a female character in the play then dressing as male, so you have a male actor dressing as a woman, dressing as a man. That is played for laughs, and I suppose the problem in tragedy is that you want it to, in order to gain your effective kind of emotional outpouring, your catharsis at the end, you maybe want the play to be taken seriously, then perhaps having roles that were in other plays used for kind of comedic effect, might actually influence the writing. But I think in terms of the attitudes presented in the play itself, there are kind of clear issues in terms of, and engaging things that we can kind of talk about in terms of how women are presented in these plays, what that reveals us to us. And I think, the key thing is actually the silenced nature of women in this society. I would have a look in the play specifically at 2 things. One is the interpretations of the women. And by interpretations here, I mean by critics. Yes, of course, you can look at critics. You've gathered hopefully some good posters on Ophelia up until this point. I'll be setting you one after the holidays on Gertrude, because I think that would be useful. But I would have a look at how the characters are interpreted by other characters in the play itself. So Gertrude is consistently characterized by her sexual desires, and perhaps as both of the Hamlets, so that's young Hamlet and old Hamlet, define her as a figure of infidelity. Yeah, they keep talking about her incest. They keep Hamlet seems incredibly perturbed by her kind of sexual license that she has, and that is how she is viewed by the other characters. In terms of on stage, she is rarely given an independent characterization, almost always on stage with the king. And in fact, her only scene in the play without the king, I'll come to that in a second. There is a second one. Her only scene in the version that we're looking at anyway, without him, is Act 3, Scene 4, where she is spying. Essentially, she's been asked to go and have a conversation with Hamlet so that Polonius can spy on it. So Gertrude is very much reduced to a figure in the play of someone who lacks autonomy, someone who is certainly sexualized by the male characters around her, and that's how she's often viewed. And in fact, critics often then go on and view her in much the same way. They describe her as a sexual figure. We only have that perspective from Hamlet. We don't have that from anyone else in the play. Gertrude's not walking around the stage, discussing her sexual desires. She doesn't have like a lengthy monologue, when she bemoans her, or champions her sex life. We don't have that from any character other than Hamlet and old Hamlet. We don't even have the king and queen. This isn't even a kind of Shakespearean play where we get the kind of loving scenes between partners. This isn't like a Romeo and Juliet where you have the kind of infatuated scenes, or an Antony and Cleopatra where they play up the passion of the characters. I challenge you to go and find me a scene in Hamlet where there's a really passionate moment between the king and Gertrude. And I think that's an interesting kind of point to have then, is that we do have this kind of interpretation of her as a kind of almost a deviant sexual figure of incest. But we never, no one else in the play seems to be bothered other than Hamlet. And that often reflects a lot more on Hamlet. And we can also look at representations of kind of femininity. We can look at Hamlet's accusations of femininity towards himself, and we can look at his accusations as to the weaknesses of women that he presents through Gertrude, and that revealing, I suppose, as much about the society and the characters and the themes of the play as anything else. And you can also look at, obviously, because she is rarely given an independent characterization, and Ophelia as well isn't, we can look at the dependency of the women in the play, and the way in which they kind of struggle to kind of engage with them. Ophelia has a similar-ish role within this. She is routinely the object of fear for Polonius, obviously her potential indiscretions. She can't really defend herself on these discretions. She is accused by both Laertes and kind of and Polonius of potentially being perhaps quote loose with Hamlet, and she tries to she somewhat attempts a defense to Laertes. She cannot speak back to her father, again because of the structural dynamics between women and men at the time, and therefore we have this figure of a kind of repressed woman in already there. And Polonius views her indiscretions as things in himself. So the role of the woman here is essentially to support and augment the male figure. And for the remainder of the play, then, she is abused and defined as a sexual being by Hamlet, who basically entirely categorizes her within this. And then she loses her sanity, and she starts to kind of explore perhaps boundaries and language that wouldn't be acceptable for a woman at the time period, because she is mad. And we have this thing that, yes, perhaps this is what she could say, but is that a positive thing? Is this something that she's like, yay, now I can finally explore these things? Or is it that this is an outpouring of inner kind of tormented womanhood that we don't get otherwise? So as a final statement, I suppose, in Hamlet, like most of Shakespeare's tragedies, the female characters exist only to further characterise the male figures, specifically with the protagonist there. Now, we've got a couple of quotes that we should hopefully already know for this one. I would be specifically looking at here then your Lee Edwards, if nothing else, because that's, I think, the best example there of that. For those of you who don't remember that was essentially the one. I'm going to paraphrase it slightly here, but it's essentially that we can imagine Hamlet's story without Ophelia, but Ophelia literally has no story without Hamlet. And we also see that, I suppose, in Lacan, who says, literally, she is linked forever for centuries to the figure of Hamlet. So we can talk about that as one way in which the female characters are presented. They are presented as a means of male representation. They are not afforded much of a voice, and as such reflect the sublimation of the female experience in a society that is geared towards male viewpoints. The only anxiety we have about making the broadly contextual ones is that then we start drifting away from AO5 and we start drifting more into AO3. I think that's more of a contextual point. So what I want to try and look at is power dynamics within the text itself, what that tells us about what the character is there for. What does Ophelia as a character represent? What does Gertrude as a character represent? Okay, so hopefully that was useful looking at these perspectives. Fundamentally, what you can look at from either a Marxist or feminist perspective in the text is looking at the structures of the play. What does that tell us about the nature of the characters? What does that tell us about the nature of the play itself? That's the key thing here. And to extend this kind of then, I gave you this question last week on your things, was that Denmark Shakespeare presents is so oppressive that the only option left for his female characters is suicide. To what extent do you agree with this assessment of Hamlet as a play? And you can look at all of kind of Showalter's theories around this. Would be really helpful to look at thinking about other writers and other ways in which she has been given more of a kind of outlet in narratives. Cool. Next week it's half term, obviously. Just be revising Hamlet and Duchess. Thank you, obviously, for your essays on the Duchess that we've already had in. Any still outstanding, please have them in. Obviously, I asked for the remainder in this morning. I will be sending out some emails later today to those who haven't. To those parents, to those who haven't. Other than that, have a great half time. And we will see you after the break for some poetry stuff. We'll be moving on to your coursework. As a heads up now as well, that will require you, I suppose, to kind of obtain some poetry in the future when you actually have to do the piece itself. I will be distributing to you via email all the poems we'll be looking at in those weeks, and I'll send them at the start of the week on the Monday, so you've got a chance to read them before the sessions. At the start of next year, obviously, because we're still not wholly certain when we're actually going back to college, we just don't know that. Let's actually shift back to this just for this last wrapping up bit. Because we just don't know when we're going back, I think what I would say fundamentally at this point is that if we're not in at the start of next year, academic year, that is obviously, then what I would recommend is that I will send out to you the anthology of poetry that we'll be looking at for your second year content. So that's your unseen poetry, not your unseen, but your modern poetry collection that we will be comparing to unseen poetry. Okay, so for the next section of course, it's going to be mostly poetry heavy. That does not mean, however, that you should take your foot off the drama pedal. You need to be revising that on a weekly basis. You just have to be, otherwise you're going to fall behind. And I've given you that the revision checklist already. If you've lost that, obviously, please send me an email over to ask for another one. But you should be working your way through that while you're not studying it. Working it, until next year we come back to it again. And then it'll be nice and fresh in your mind, and you won't have to go, oh God, I don't remember anything about these plays. Because if you forget now how to read these things, you're going to struggle in the long term. Okay, so keep at it. Do these tasks this week. Here they all are. And I'll see you soon. Actually, specifically, I'll see you on Thursday. Those of you who want to come and get the digital lesson treatment on the first scene of Hamlet again. When I'm planning it, it might turn out that I can do more than the first scene, in which case we'll do 1 and 2. But we'll see on that one. Okay? Alright, guys. See you later. Bye.